This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
Hey everybody, this is obviously Razib, and I am here today with a return guest, I believe our first return guest on the Unsupervised Learning podcast, Samo Burja. Samuel, can you introduce yourself?
It's great to be here with you, Razib. I'm a founder of a company called Bismarck Analysis, which is a political risk consulting firm, and I'm also a research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. I mostly like thinking about history, civilization, institutions, the stuff your audience likes.
Yeah, I gotta say, audience really likes you. You're on partly because multiple people who are subscribers, in terms of they actually paid, did ask if you were going to come on again. Partly because I think, you have this interdisciplinary, kind of out of the box way of looking at things. And so nerds really like listening to you, but you also present something different than the usual. What's really unfair, what you could consume in, say, a science magazine or something like that. I think it's a little different, and I think that's why they really asked a couple of times, because I don't know if they can hear some of the views that you express very often in other places. So, for example, I want to talk to you about your piece in Palladium, Why Civilization is Older Than We Thought. Now, the title, this could be on some conspiracy website or some New Age website. Actually, we're all Lemurians or, Atlanteans, like this sort of thing, right? These are the platforms and places you see ideas like this. But your piece is not, it's not some crazy New Agey, conspiracy theory piece. It's actually like pretty analytical and pretty much of a deep dive into the latest. A lot of it's archaeology. Some of it is kind of prehistory, history, parahistory. I don't know. You might even say, just in terms of the expectations that we have in our models of the way the world works and how we might actually be missing something out there. And so, can you just talk about, just give us a general introduction to your piece in Palladium that came out as of when we're recording about 3 weeks ago?
Yes. And, you're exactly right when it comes to, say, the connotations of rethinking early history. Unfortunately, the space can be sometimes dominated by cranks. But the piece I wrote is essentially just taking the current findings of archaeology and drawing what consequences we can from that. One of the key focuses of the piece is a particular archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe. This is a Turkish name. It translates into Potbelly Hill, and it's a site that was discovered in the mid 1990s by a German archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, and it's been sort of changing archaeologists' consensus and conception of the Neolithic, especially, ever since. One of the interesting things about the site is that it's 11,500 years old, which predates the normal consensus date for agriculture. However, even that date is, it's somewhat in flux, and there are interesting finds also that move that. I suspect one of the reasons that this hasn't made it into broader discourse, wider discourse, is not just the difficulty of writing about this and talking about this in a way that does justice to, I think, often the very good work of archaeologists, but just because there's not a lot of competent popularization of what are just really these very niche, very narrow topics. Like if you think of archaeology, it sounds kind of sexy. It feels like, it's Indiana Jones. There should be so many people writing about these finds, but it's actually fairly rare, right? The last also, popularizer that had sort of any kind of real archaeological background that I can think of is Dr. Zahir Hawass, an Egyptologist who, of course, being attached to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, is, sort of promoting Egypt in a professional capacity, right? It's Egyptian state policy to, try to revive their sagging tourism sector. And, these beautiful finds that we hear about from Egypt, like the recently discovered, city, I think it's a New Kingdom city. These are all partially promoted for this purpose. Now, anything that doesn't have such a strong promotion behind it, it's to a lot of people just a pile of rocks, no matter how impressive or, how well arranged this pile of rocks is. And it doesn't get that much press outside of niche publications.
Yeah, so I will say that for my some of my Substack pieces where I integrate a lot of archaeology, I do read archaeology papers, and they're um, they're quite extensive, and you can have a 40-page paper where 30 pages are descriptions of site after site after site, or more precisely, maybe like a subsection of a site, and so they're very very heavy on description, but they're not super heavy on big conceptual frameworks. Like, I don't know if they're just taught not to do that at university and graduate school, but it's really hard to integrate it into something bigger. A lot of the time, they're really focused on the narrow details. So, something like this site in Turkey, I mean, this is a podcast, so it's not visual, but you really need to see it to understand why it's a big deal. Uh, I mean, looking at the archaeological finds, the detail, the depiction of the animals, or whatever these things are, I mean, it's gonna trigger ideas and thoughts of ancient aliens. They're just they're really really cool, really really exotic, and as you said, this is before this is supposed to happen, right? So if it's before it's supposed to happen, how do you exactly write about it without seeming crazy?
Well, I think part of the puzzle here is that I think people don't understand the mandate of archaeology. Right? Archaeology as a field, actually, in its core, is just describing these finds, and the main technical skill is, unearthing them, discovering them, unearthing these finds, cataloging them, dating them, trying to figure out whether there are correspondences with others. Archaeologists are not tasked with rethinking, these big picture ideas of where civilization emerged and so on. And when you dive into, well, who is tasked with this, you realize that often it's historians more than archaeologists themselves. Now, history is a field with, let's say, long time horizons, right? You often can wait for decades for a new seminal work to emerge. I'm sure that, since you're so well read in the historical literature, you must have seen that there are book series that are excellent that you wish were finished but aren't finished because the author died died of old age while writing
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that happens in history and happens in few other fields. So I think that we're going to see some amazing books and some amazing, after these books are written, then there are going to be more amazing articles. All I did in this piece was I skipped that step, right? I read the boring, overly descriptive academic archaeological papers. I went to the Göbekli Tepe site itself. I talked to some of the experts that had worked there, both like from the German team and from the new Turkish team that is sort of taking over the dig. Currently, digs are paused. Perhaps for your audience, I think they might appreciate us briefly describing the site. I think it's best described as several adjacent, we presume temples, though again, what does it mean when an archaeologist says temple? It just means, well, it's a big communal building. We see, no evidence of habitation. What is it? Well, I guess it's a temple or a meeting hall or something, right? There's no much more concrete evidence than that. So these are several adjacent temples. The rooms themselves are usually oval or round. Later, like about a few thousand years later, on the same site, they build some more buildings that have some similar patterns, some similar features, but they transitioned to square rooms. However, this very oldest site, right? These are round or oval enclosures. They're each lined with these tall T-shaped pillars. Now, these pillars are big. Each is from 10 to 20 tons. If you stand next to one, you're dwarfed by it. These are quite tall. The ground is either compacted dirt or smooth it, or just like an exposed bedrock that's just been smoothed over. I apologize, my English fails me here. Which is actually very labor intensive. If you imagine it, like you expose the bedrock, then you level it, then you try to kind of polish it, and only then do you get to the business of erecting these large T-shaped pillars. We have some idea of where they came from. There's a quarry apparently also discovered not too far away, basically on the same hill. It still takes quite a bit of human labor to assemble this site, right? To assemble these buildings, to bring these, carved stones up here, to build the sort of like, walls around them. The estimate that Klaus Schmidt himself gave was basically that it would take about 500 laborers to complete construction of one of these temples.
Yeah, and so, I mean, 500 is not a trivial amount. So I think the primary question, the primary surprise, the primary shock is, all right, they're hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers are imagined as small bands, something like, the Bushmen, the Khoisan of the Kalahari, maybe the Mobutu Pygmies of the deep rainforest. But, a lot of scholars have been saying now for the past couple of decades, to be frank, that there might be a serious misconception in how we imagine prehistoric hunter-gatherers in terms of how sedentary or how dense they could be because of the sample bias of who we classify as hunter-gatherers today. But, these people go through a sieve in terms of why they're still hunter-gatherers today, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, the very obvious answer to this question, I'm sure one that you're hinting at, is that the prime land around the world, right? The fertile valleys, the lush forests, the grassy plains, the inhabitable highlands. This has all been taken by, say, agriculturalists or at times pastoralists. Any remaining hunter-gatherer societies must exist in very marginal terrain. So when we look at, say, hunter-gatherers today, or even, heck, the hunter-gatherers of 1930 or 1960, much earlier in anthropology's history, and here I have to emphasize, we do rely on the reports of Western anthropologists. It's very notable that, very few of us go to the Amazon rainforest or, small islands off the coast of India to actually observe them. So we have to rely on these reports of anthropologists that, sometimes carry their own biases and have their own problems.
Yeah.
But the key issue here is that, the people we're seeing in these biomes, right? The people we're seeing living in these ecosystems, these territories, these are sort of, in some ways, they're not a representative sample of what Stone Age man and his life was like. They are not the typical tribe of 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting, there are whole fields that are predicated on studying these hunter-gatherers, these last hunter-gatherers who've lived this, quote, Paleolithic lifestyle continuously and uninterrupted since the emergence of agriculture in the Near East. And yet, we're actually not totally sure that these people are very representative. And from that, one can derive the conclusion that maybe our conclusions based on these people is not entirely representative. Maybe they don't live in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, as evolutionary psychologists would say. And so I think, some of the point of your Palladium piece is to reconceptualize our past by kind of opening wide the horizons of the possible. Because, using the San or the Mobutu Pygmies as models or Siberian hunter gatherers, to give another example, because there were some of them that persisted pretty down to the Soviet period. Uh, you know, go Göbekli Tepe just shouldn't exist. Like it doesn't exist, and that's why. So you mentioned offhand, I didn't know this. It was misdated for a while. Can you talk about that?
Well, it was quite profoundly misstated for a while. The interesting thing here is how our assumptions often guide the process of scientific discovery. This is true not just of archaeology. This is even true of a seemingly rigorous field such as physics. Right, like at the start of the 20th century, there's an infamous anecdote with the oil drop experiments designed to, I think, determine the mass of an electron that Richard Feynman writes about, where physicists discovered the expected quantity, and then only slowly, after several years of experiment, step after step after step, they revised it. They revised it until they got the correct number. So why is this embarrassing? Well, it's embarrassing because the correct number is an order of magnitude different. And instead of the very next result finding the error in the original experiment, the experimenters, of course, were anchored on this first incorrect result. And they just kept trying to sort of consciously or subconsciously work their way towards that expected result. To tie this to the Göbekli Tepe site, the Göbekli Tepe site was actually first explored and dug in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a collaboration between the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul, and they identified correctly Stone Age tools. However, their expectation of the site that was the Göbekli Tepe site itself, with some part of the pillars still visible and so on, they assumed that can't possibly be Stone Age artifacts. So what they assumed was, okay, this site is much too old for there to have been construction. What must have happened here is there was a Byzantine graveyard, right? So a medieval graveyard built over this much older site with its tools and so on, and its animal bones.
Yeah.
And the actual thing is, of course, that no, there wasn't, right? These were all finds from this really old period. And they weren't that interested in the medieval cemetery, so they didn't dig it up, right?
Yeah.
And this actually leads also to a much later discovery and shows the importance of archival work once you have a new paradigm. Klaus had, in fact, looked at and worked at a very similar site, right? There's a very similar site that is, I have to actually look at, what it's called. I think it's called Nevali Kori. And, if you have someone who's Turkish in the audience, I'm sure they can send me a correction so that I can pronounce that name correctly as well, which was in its own way a revolutionary site as well. However, that's a younger site. It's a site that was like 10,400 years old, and it had shown to be the oldest domesticated origin of einkorn wheat, right? So this is the earliest kind of use of agriculture. But the fun part about this is Klaus recognized the features, and he was searching for more sites like Nevali Kori. He didn't know whether Göbekli Tepe would end up being even older. He suspected. But when he was finding these reports in the archives, he was convinced that, okay, this is where I have to go dig. It's not that far from Nevali Kori. It's in the same region. This is all, at the very edge of the Fertile Crescent, right? The very southern border of Turkey next to Syria. It's quite plausible we'll find more stuff here. And it's an area also that honestly has been underexplored by archaeologists, right? This is Kurdish territory. The geopolitics of the 20th century were what they were. This was not a place where you ever saw, British archaeologists or French archaeologists, because, it remained sovereign territory of first the Ottoman Empire and then the Turkish Republic. So it waited for different political conditions before digs were even allowed. So there's some reason for it to be neglected. But still, the point being, Klaus Schmidt worked at Nevali Kori. And because he was searching for similar sites to Nevali Kori in the same region, right? Both Nevali Kori and Göbekli Tepe are near the border with Syria. This is, a terrain with lots of dry hills, and it is a is a terrain, near the origin of the Tigris and Euphrates River, right? So it's like a dry territory with, however, irrigation is possible due to the rivers. And in this regard, except for the hilliness, it's very similar to the rest of the Fertile Crescent. Schmidt also had this theory that, basically temples and religious centers tend to be built in these like high elevation areas. And this was kind of, idiosyncratic to him. I'm not sure that I would have preferred to examine the hills versus, say, focus more on the valleys, where I honestly think more than a temple, a new Neolithic settlement that was even older would have been even more informative. But I still think the temple itself is such an amazing discovery that even though I don't ultimately share Schmidt's hypothesis about the primacy of religion, though again, religion is super important, and we can talk about its sociological and historical role, I think that despite that, he was pursuing a very productive hypothesis. And this is, I think, something we often lose track of, that a scientific hypothesis doesn't have to be, right to be scientifically productive. Here again, I'm also thinking of, earlier archaeologist adventurers such as Schliemann, who are, Iliad in hand, hunting for Troy. Now, is this the most scientific way to approach it? No. Did this site find the location of Troy? Well, it did, and lots of other pieces of treasure. Some in Greece, some in Turkey. So there's always this question of who are the people who end up pushing it forward, and it seems sometimes
Yeah.
it's not a prestigious collaboration by the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul. Rather, it's a somewhat hungry, a somewhat contrarian German grad student, basically.
Well, so you mentioned Schliemann, and you mentioned Schliemann in the piece. Could you talk about Heinrich Schliemann a little bit? Because I think he's someone that more people should know more about.
Yeah, Schliemann is someone that makes modern archaeologists kind of roll their eyes, at least uh, when I mention him, because he's very much an example of an adventurer archaeologist, right? He is the discoverer of Troy, but also the discoverer of various Mycenaean finds. Mycenaean Greece being, of course, the civilization that existed prior to the late Bronze Age collapse, and that's considered a predecessor to classical Greek civilization. He was wrong in some ways. For example, when he found this beautiful golden Mycenaean mask, he of course immediately called it, the funeral mask of Agamemnon. That's the maximally poetic thing you can do with that beautiful golden mask, and it's such a poetic name that we've kept it, even though, of course, there's no reason to think this is Agamemnon's. There's no reason even to think Agamemnon, exactly as described in the Iliad, existed. However, the same sort of poetic adventure mindset lent itself well to the discovery of Troy. Troy in the 19th century, we should understand, this is the era of higher criticism. Higher criticism means this revision of the Bible, right? Where they start looking at the Bible as just another text. And if the Bible isn't spared in a still predominantly Christian society, the same axe of skepticism was taken to all the other classics, such as the Iliad, right? So at the time when Schliemann is digging, the Iliad, which, for many centuries was basically believed to be essentially a true account, though a glorified account of real war, was dismissed as pure myth. Sometimes the axe of skepticism chops too much, right? It removes not just the dead trees, but tries to hit the living trees as well. It turned out that a city did exist, and because the city exists, I think we also have to recognize that the Iliad itself had something of a historical basis. Now, of course, there are all sorts of good and interesting arguments that came out of this tradition of higher criticism, right? This tradition of looking at the text, analyzing it, trying to figure out if it has one author or many authors, and so on. And one of the results that I actually trust from this investigation is that it was probably orally transmitted for the longest period of time, right? However, one of the things about this, even these oral traditions, that eventually, the era of the bard comes, where you sort of transition from an oral culture to a written culture. And that's usually when something like the Iliad gets written down and then gets a canonicized form. But before it reaches that written form, uh, you know, verbal transmission, multi-generational oral memory can be very reliable, but only if the socioeconomic or ecological niche of the speakers and singers persists. So as soon as you change these niches, stories change wildly. And for two pieces of evidence, there is an analysis of fairy tales where it's shown that several fairy tales in modern Europe actually originate from the Bronze Age, and they do this via a comparative phylogenetic analysis of these shared Indo-European folk tales. And the other piece of evidence is Australian Aboriginal tales accurately describe some changes of Australia's geography, rivers, coastlines, mountains, lakes, and climate shifts for up to 10,000 years ago. Now, again, there's a little bit of a selection effect. Do we trust the anthropologists interviewing the Australian Aborigines? Well, maybe we do, or maybe they try to present them in as favorable a light as possible because they, of course, have empathy and sympathy for them. 100 years ago, it would have been the opposite. They would have been inclined to, dismiss them, denigrate them, etc.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I mean, I just bring up Schliemann because he is in a way a destructive character.
True.
In terms of his methods are not ones we would want to emulate, and yet the reality is his impulses, they cut in another direction too. In terms of, he was very bold, very radical, and he went where others probably would have been too cautious to go. And in terms of, like, this particular finding and some of the things you're saying here, they're just so weird and fantastical. I have a really hard time imagining mainstream academics at the center of professions really exploring these issues.
Well, yeah, Schliemann himself, a Greek court back in the day found him guilty of smuggling jewelry found at a site out of the Ottoman Empire, and he had to pay a fee of 50,000 gold francs to the Constantinople Imperial Museum. So he was also in a way implicated in this other great vice of both adventurers, but also in a bit quieter way, modern archaeology, which is the issue that often when these sites are discovered, right, by say random farmers or in some parts, corrupt officials, often these artifacts just get sold off on the black market, and they never really, they never really enter a museum. They never even are properly cataloged or examined.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, cataloged and examined is an interesting point too, because as you're indicating, we probably have discovered sites that are a lot more interesting and a lot older,
Oh, yes.
but they haven't been interpreted correctly, right? So I mean, there actually could be a niche for archaeological data scientists who scrape through the literature and try to figure out what's a good candidate to reanalyze.
I completely agree because there are always these subtle flaws with all sorts of dating procedures, right? Like carbon 14 dating relies on organic matter. And then if you have a wrong hypothesis as to where the organic matter resides or where it was, when it was added or how it entered a site, you can easily get the wrong date. And this is where I would again invoke the, oil drop experiment. I think going through some of the older sites that have been discovered or sites that were dated, like let's say a few decades ago when radiocarbon dating was just getting started, and then just having this like critical perspective on it, re-examining it, and trying to find some good candidates where you try to do essentially, you try to replicate the result or you try to break the old result, redate it. I think we have some surprises in the archives already. I think it doesn't even require a new discovery, just as you pointed out. I would absolutely love it if archaeology had, its own small replication crisis where it was found that, actually a few decades ago, the previous generation of archaeologists was actually a bit sloppy with its dating. We actually can, now that we see that older sites exist, we can go back and we can redate them. We can date them accurately.
Yeah. So, this Turkish site, this is kind of the beginning in terms of your hypothesis. You think there could be a lot of older sites, right? Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, I go through a detailed analysis in the article of whether it's possible that hunter-gatherers could have, say, supported the labor force needed to build the Göbekli Tepe site. I come to the conclusion, and we can talk a little bit about this too, that yeah, complex construction isn't out of range for some of these hunter-gatherer societies, like we said earlier. The ones that were existing in much richer biomes. There are some example of this. There are some examples of this that are recorded. One example of such a group would be the Calusa tribe of southwestern Florida. They were basically, Native American society that supported, temple construction, great hall construction, walls, and they relied on fishing rather than on agriculture. They had no agriculture whatsoever. This is, of course, though, a 14th century society. So it's pre-Columbian contact, but it's well after the advent of agriculture. So you could see someone say, making an argument that, oh, okay, fishing is possible, but you needed agriculture to bootstrap this up. I think the strongest counterexample to this would be the discovery, a few hundred miles south of Moscow, of a giant circle made out of mammoth bone. Right? We don't quite know what the original structure was for, but it's
Uh-huh.
made out of the remains of about 60 mammoths. So if we assume this is a nomadic people with a nomadic existence, that's quite a bit of labor, really, to like move those bones around. This isn't just butchering a mammoth and letting the bones lie. This is doing proper construction out of this material. And note, it's kind of funny to us. Why would mammoth bone be like a cheap and abundant material? But then you have to remember that there are not many forests in ice age, basically ice age Siberia, right? So you use what you have. Still, this is it's a pretty big site in its own right, and it's 25,000 years old, though it's much smaller and doesn't involve the workmanship of say Göbekli Tepe. So all of these reasons, there's all these reasons we can think of to say, okay, very abundant fishing or very abundant wildlife can sustain larger numbers. I think the Göbekli Tepe site, the climatological papers that I read, and I think there's no particular reason to distrust them, suggest the environment was quite dry 11,000 years ago. In fact, that's probably one of the reasons why agriculture seemed so compelling, say, a millennia later. So, if it's not fishing, since the coastline is many hundreds of miles away, if it's not, herds of buffalo or mammoth, since this is like a dry, hilly region, since it's not an extremely ecologically rich forest, like I don't know what the Ohlone tribes of California once used, chestnut forests and so on. Well, I think we have to conclude that, kind of Occam's razor here is, yeah, these people were probably fed by agriculture. I'm sure that there was hunting. I'm sure that they also ate animals. Workers need protein after all. But the baseline of calories had to have been provided by agriculture. This would be my conclusion here. And because of this, we found the temple. It requires a labor force. We haven't yet found how the labor force was fed. I think it's definitely agriculture. And as soon as you assume that this practice of agriculture, at least occasionally, happened before the last ice age, the date of this last ice age, that it's 11,000 years old. Well, really, we no longer have this grounding assumption that keeps us stuck at the 10,000 year timeline. I think easily there might have been agriculture 20,000 years ago, or 30 or 40,000 years ago. As soon as you have that agriculture, I believe that occasionally you will see permanent settlements. And this is one of the things that I conclude the article with. I offer a long bet, right? I offer a bet that within the next 20 years, we will have found at least one permanent settlement that's older than 20,000 years. There is also some evidence for earlier agriculture, right? There is the I think it's called the Ohlone site. in near the near the Sea of Galilee in Israel, which is 23,000 years old. But of course, since this is so much older than what is quote unquote proven agriculture, the paper discusses it as proto agriculture. I really, when I looked at the paper, I was like, okay, there's evidence of harvesting. There's evidence of cultivation and various kinds of weeds present. They call this small scale trial cultivation, and I'm just like, there's no reason to call it a trial cultivation.
Yeah.
Tell me, Razib, what are the odds that we discover a 23,000-year-old experiment? I think they're nil. I think we have to
Yeah.
say this
Yeah.
isn't trial cultivation. This is just small scale cultivation, and we shouldn't call it proto agriculture. We should call it agriculture. The big question, of course,
Yeah.
is how soon or late after the adoption of agriculture into the sort of survival toolkit of Neolithic peoples do we start to see these permanent settlements, right, that are exclusively or predominantly reliant on agriculture? I think one of the things we have to reevaluate is our concept of quote unquote primitive man. I think it's the case that perhaps farming coexisted as one way of feeding yourself in addition to fishing and hunting and gathering for tens of thousands of years. Honestly, maybe even for as long as Homo sapiens has been around. I would not be shocked if we found evidence of, say, very small scale farming, that's not the dominant mode of, sustaining, it's not the dominant source of calories, going 100,000 years back. Especially instructive here is, I think, the practices of gardening that we do sometimes see with peoples we would describe as hunter-gatherers, where they, instead of for calories, they pursue and cultivate some plants for medicinal purposes.
Yeah. I think this brings to mind a bigger question that I have about how many revolutions do we have? So, for example, a lot of listeners versed in economic history will know that basically the idea of an industrial revolution is highly disputed by a lot of economists now, where they think actually it's kind of a more gradual process. There was a long fuse, and stuff happens in a cumulative fashion, and with exponential rates of change, at some point you just say, oh, this is like a break, it's a revolution, things have totally changed. But actually a lot of the preconditions for the industrial revolution go back pretty far, and it's just like everything had to come together and kind of accelerate. So using this model for, say, agriculture, you could imagine a scenario where, as you were saying, some sort of primitive gardening slash agriculture is a mode of production that's in the repertoire of a lot of societies, but for whatever reason, there was lacking some X factor which allowed it to break out and kind of overwhelm everything else. And I don't know what that would be. I haven't thought about this in detail, but it just seems natural, going off the industrial revolution. Or, for example, Peter Church has looked at the axial age, the emergence of these meta-ethnic ideologies, these higher religions, and it looks like from the data that, again, it's more of a situation where it wasn't a discontinuity, that it was a gradual change, and then it happened so fast over a particular period, the rate of change, that it makes it look like it's a break, And so I just wonder if that's what we're looking at here, where the rate of cultural change keeps accelerating in our lineage over the past million years, where the Oldowan technology was around forever, then the Acheulean, and then all of a sudden the technologies go faster and faster, where it's like, oh, this technology is only around, this archaeological tradition is only around for 5,000 years, which is not that long, supposedly. But then you think, wait, 5,000 years? Like 5,000 years is like from from early Sumeria to us. So, I mean,
Yes.
how is this technology maintaining itself that long? So obviously the rate of change is getting more and more rapid. And, from the point of view of the past, we're in perpetual revolution.
Yeah, I think this is a very good point where sort of the roots of a seemingly sudden transformation is often something that's millennia in the past, right? But I think what I also want to add to this model is that, even if we take these exponential curves, these are not smooth curves. You have peaks that are followed by declines as well. Classic examples here might be, say, the mechanical technology of Hellenistic era Greece is in many ways comparable to 17th or 18th century machinery. You have fun things like, Heron's steam engine, which of course, it's not comparable to Watt's steam engine. However, Heron's steam engine itself shows that some important scientific principles were understood. The other interesting example here would be the Antikythera mechanism, which I'm sure you've already discussed or used as an example in your show so far, which we
Yeah.
only have this marvelous piece of essentially 2nd century BC clockwork because it was on a ship, and the ship sunk, and therefore no one melted it down for parts. Tell me, Razib, how long would a land-bound version of the Antikythera mechanism made out of precious bronze have lasted during the Dark Ages? I don't think very long.
Yeah. So you're bringing up something like pretty interesting to me, which is the idea of decline and collapse, which, from a Whiggish perspective, and by this I mean, you kind of see history. So, I think one of the implicit models here, even if it's no longer the universal model in academia, it still looms over us, is this idea, history and civilization begins at Sumer. From Sumer, it progresses over time to the Greeks, from the Greeks to the Romans. There was this one single correction, at least in the West, in the medieval period, and then it just keeps, by the late medieval Renaissance, it keeps going, and here we are, right? I think one of the implications of some of the things you're saying is there were collapses, there were, quote, regressions, shifts away from complexity, shifts away from civilization as such, and there were long periods of darkness, and we come back out of it. The idea that the ancients had that the past was better might not be so crazy. What do you think about that?
I think this is completely correct. Your audience is probably already familiar. I know you've written on the topic of the Bronze Age collapse, which is 1000 BC, where we see a shocking regression. Right, there are some areas around the Eastern Mediterranean where, during this time period, in the immediate aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, we do not find any evidence of pottery. Like, that's pretty extreme, right? Pottery's been old hat for us for many tens of thousands of years, so much so that, after it's introduced, archaeologists use it as a proxy of human habitation. So it's possible that some areas had such a profound crash in human population that they, for a few decades or a century or so, became uninhabited, or mostly uninhabited. Other areas, basically urban life ended. We talked about the Mycenaean civilization as the precursor of classical Greek civilization. There is a period that coincides with the Bronze Age collapse called the Greek Dark Age, where it's a 400-year period where writing is lost, right? So there's a period where the old Mycenaean and Minoan writing systems go away, several centuries of illiteracy, and then emerges the precursor to what we think of as Greek writing, the alphabet-based systems. And there are other examples we can cite outside of the Middle East. The classic example here might be that of Mayan civilization. We usually mentally group the Mayans together with the Incas and the Aztecs, and I think, at least implicitly, a lot of people think that it's, the conquistadors do the Mayans in. And that's not true at
Yeah.
all. Like, Mayan civilization is like in terminal decline centuries before contact with the Spanish. And another example that we can cite is, I'm sure you've, there is a very fascinating site. It's called Mohenjo-Daro. It's an
Yeah.
archaeological site in modern day Pakistan, near, the Indus, near the, I think, Indus River.
Yeah.
And it was built around 2500 BCE. So this is 4,500 years ago. There's a flourishing civilization called the Indus Valley Civilization. We either assumed they didn't have writing or that we failed to decipher their writing. I honestly think we failed to decipher their writing because we only found, these short strings of pretty symbolic looking script. And this civilization just vanishes. It just undergoes a profound collapse, a profound drop in population density, and then later Indian civilization develops along very different lines.
Yeah. It's you're bringing up examples which a lot of people would think is exceptional, but then you bring up enough of examples and maybe not. So here's another example which I'm sure you know about, but the Uruk civilization, or whatever it was, because we don't have writing from it. Fourth millennium, BC. Is it fourth? yeah, fourth millennium BC, before 3000 BC, this society that seems very similar in terms of material technology all across Mesopotamia into, southeast Turkey and into Syria, it collapses right before the Sumerians emerge. And the Sumerian civilization is actually considerably smaller in scope and spatial distribution. And a lot of people wonder if, the legends of like the fall, the collapse of civilization, the flood, all of this stuff comes out of Sumerians remembering the collapse of this previous civilization, which we're never going to figure out. I mean, at least in terms of writing, because they didn't have writing, they had some sort of accounting methods. And so, for us today, I think we see ourselves as special, as blessed people in a way where I mean that could never happen. And yet, you've talked in your other writings about loss of technological skill, just de-skilling these other things. And I mean, could we? I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, are we ourselves vulnerable to this sort of process, and we're just oblivious to it?
I think to some extent we are. I would cautiously say that, there are some technologies that seem to survive civilizational collapse fairly well. So, we didn't lose metallurgy with the fall of the Roman Empire. And there's certainly the very basics of agriculture continued to exist after, say, the fall of Mohenjo-daro, right? So, even though people might not have had sewers or other types of systems anymore, they abandoned urban life, that didn't mean everything went away. So I would say that in the
Yeah.
big sweep of the last, and when I say 10,000 years of history, I don't mean history starts 10,000 years ago, right? What I mean here is the barrier between history and prehistory, where we often have, let's say, about 6,000 years of written sources. And everything before this, we have to like piece together through, these material finds that we interpret. Of course, once you dig up a city, it pretty much does look like a city. So you're forced to conclude that, yes, the Uruk society was a civilization, even if they
Yeah.
didn't quite have writing as we understand it. I mean, heck, the Incan
Yeah.
civilization, much more recent, doesn't have writing the way we would think of it. Has the weird sort of not writing or notation system,
Yeah.
or what is it? Yeah,
Cupu. I don't know how to say it.
exactly.
Listeners know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I mean, the Incas, the way they're described by the conquistador, like we have eyewitnesses, right? I think it's hard to say it's not a civilization, but it didn't have writing. It would have had monumental architecture left behind if it disappeared before the conquistadors, before the Spaniards arrived. So we could have said something about it in the generality, but not in the detail. And I think it goes to show that a lot of these, quote, pre-civilized, pre-literate societies would have seemed pretty complex to us if we could just see them with our own eyes. People can do a lot of things with the counting of literacy. They figure out workarounds. Literacy is obviously better, and once societies become literate, they try to stay literate. But it doesn't seem like it's necessary for the type of complexity we've been talking about on this episode. So,
Mhm.
in your piece, you are talking about, agriculture going back 100,000 years. I just want to bring up an issue. My friend Greg Cochran once said that we know that humans were different like 114,000 years ago during the Eemian interglacial because they never really did agriculture. They never really took off. So would you at least agree that, there's some sort of cognitive or cultural barriers so that it had to be 100,000 years or later? Because it doesn't seem like the previous interglacial we entered liftoff.
Well, I will say, certainly, I would agree that humans have been changing slowly. I'm not quite sure when I would put the point of, human, this transformation, right? And you're talking about, say, a period of 100,000 years ago. I would almost want to turn this on its head. Okay, let's say that there's something genetically super novel, biologically super novel that happens to humans 70,000 years ago, right? Or 80,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago. Do we really believe that then, for 75 of those 80,000 years, they never, experimented with agriculture, never built permanent settlements, never adopted strange religious cults, never, engaged in large scale warfare or raids or something like this? I'm a little bit skeptical of that view of history. Like I sometimes like to, you know, um, I sometimes like to contrast, the Steven Pinker view of history, right? The Steven Pinker view being essentially this like slowly compounding, positive, mildly exponential trend of the better angels of our nature winning. So there's the Steven Pinker view of history, with the Robert E. Howard view of history, being the author of pulp fiction such as Conan the Barbarian, where the world of
Yeah.
Conan the Barbarian is a world of abandoned burial mounds, where sometimes in these mounds you find swords that you don't know how to make yourself, and the few cities that exist are captured by decadent society and evil snake cults that practice human sacrifice, and life is brutish and violent, and peoples get replaced over and over and over again. It
Hey,
seems to
hey.
me, the Robert E. Howard
It's
thing is better.
it sounds like you've been listening to my Indo-European podcast. So
I mean,
I like to I
yeah.
like to use the beginning of the first Conan movie as an illustration of the arrival of the Yamnaya, just as a joke.
Well, I have to actually credit this to, I think, Greg Cochran. I think first introduced this comparison like a few years ago. There's this blog post I remember reading where he was talking about violence in antiquity, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a common observation, but I feel it's a good one.
Yeah, well, so we're talking about decline and civilizational collapse. I have only recently kind of totally internalized the reality that late Neolithic European societies, the funnel beaker, the people that made Stonehenge, they actually were pretty intense in terms of their material culture, which is how we moderns, hedonistic moderns, kind of recognize, say, the fall of Rome, or as you're saying, pottery disappears. Uh, they had gotten to a certain level of complexity. The Varna culture in Bulgaria pioneered copper smelting, it seems like. And then you have the culture in Moldova, where you had a huge towns and like awesome pottery. And this all ended 5,000 years ago, and the Indo-Europeans arrived. And a lot of people in the past would be like, okay, like this is like the superior race that brought civilization to Europe. But now that I'm talking to archaeologists, they basically just admit, actually, the Indo-Europeans might just have been like barbarians, like picking up the pieces after societal collapse, because they don't leave that many remains. The monumental architecture and other things actually take a while to come back. It shifts back to a pretty pastoral society.
I mean, I think this is something, and this is an excellent example. And I haven't heard, I have read your writing on this topic, on the Indo-European expansion specifically. I think the correct way for us to think about it is that even before we have written sources, Eurasia is Eurasia. You have this back and forth of agriculturalists versus pastoralists. And I think if you went far enough, you would also have the reemergence of occasionally hunter-gatherers in the mix. I really wouldn't be shocked if some areas went to farming, back away from farming to hunting and gathering, and then back to farming again, due to like intermediate factors like ecological collapse or desertification or whatever. You might also be interested in another example, which is in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, a different language group, the Semitic language group. They're basically pastoralists, and they're basically, grazing goats and sheep in the ruins of what was once mighty Sumerian and Babylonian and Assyrian cities.
Yeah,
Or pardon me,
yeah,
Babylonians are later. Assyrians and Sumerians, certainly. Yeah.
yeah. No, the past is super complex. I guess what we're getting at, and I kind of mentioned it with Whig history, we, Americans, moderns, we tend to think of history in a linear way, kind of going from lower to higher, but it's kind of been a zigzag. And, I mean, the zigzag is not even, it can zag a lot and zig a lot, so like Britain, for example, might not have had the same intensity of economic exploitation that it had during the late Roman period until the 18th century, if you go by pollution in the ponds, right? That's a really long time. Now, I'm not like saying that late medieval Europe wasn't complex, but there were some areas that just didn't recover to the Roman maximum or the Roman intensity until the early modern period. And so this is a really, really long regression. So, the trend line still holds, but there's so many details in the trend line that we need to interrogate and think about. And I think like this is in this conversation with you, we're kind of taking it to the next level. Okay, like let's think beyond history. Let's think towards prehistory, right? We think of this like, we were cavemen and then we left the caves and we never
We
looked
built the
back.
pyramids or
Yeah,
something,
yeah,
and then we started philosophizing in togas, and then before you know it, we were making
yeah.
steam engines.
Yeah, so this is the cartoon. This is like the first book of history you get when you're 6 or 7, with the little cartoons, and you're just saying, that's really wrong in the detail.
Yeah, it's completely. I think it's completely wrong. I think the correct childhood cartoon, if we could make a new one that's like anthropologically, archaeologically accurate, it would be people living in a camp that looks much like a village, sustaining themselves through fishing, through hunting, through gathering. In the corner is a small, herb garden. The second picture has, classical agriculture. The third picture has an abandoned farm, and people on horses are grazing their horses. And then the fourth picture has farms again, and the fifth picture has a simple steam engine, followed by again horsemen, horsemen grazing their horses, and only then, much later, the classical pictures of the 19th century factory or whatever. So I feel that history would still make a fun children's book. Someone just has to make it.
Yeah, yeah. I think as we're closing out here, I think maybe we got an idea for a Kickstarter for you, Samo.
I mean, I'd certainly get one for my kids. I don't know. Would you get one for yours?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, this sort of stuff is like kids love this stuff. They love the past. I think it's a story, right? That's part of our evolution. That's common. Like we love stories, we love narratives, and yeah, the narrative is getting a little more complex. But what ultimately
It
matters
still
is
makes
what's
for
the
a good
truth.
story.
It
And
still
it's
makes for
better
a
to
good
have a true
story,
story. Yeah.
exactly, a true story to understand the past. Is essential because we're going into the future, and I want to do a podcast in the future with you, maybe after like another interval where you get some more Palladium pieces out and elsewhere, but about the future because we've talked about the past. I
Mhm.
want to talk more about the future because I think a lot of what you're writing, it's not really about the past; it's about the future, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I feel like, the future is real, the past is real. And when it comes to our data set of, thinking about social sciences or thinking about humans or the big sweep of history, the long now, so to speak, we really have to make use of this data set. To predict the future or think about it, to see what we can expect, I think we really have to look at these big, broad, these big, deep cycles of human history. And, I'd love to come back and talk about what might our own civilizational collapse look like, and what might the next civilization look like.
Well, I mean, that's going to be really interesting, and I really want to talk about it, but I'm a little freaked out about thinking about that right now. Like, let's wait until COVID's faded out just a little.
Let's relax a bit. Let's relax. Yeah, let's wait for the
Yeah,
plague to
let's
end.
take. There you go. Okay, with that, I will talk to you soon, Samo.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
This podcast for kids. This